Welcome to Northern Beaches Living. This is our very first deep dive, and wow, what a place to start. There's just something undeniably special about the Northern Beaches, isn't
Oh,
there?
absolutely.
Maybe it's the way the coastline unfolds, those iconic surf breaks, the national parks pushing right down to the water, or
hmm
just that distinct blend of, relaxed community life and outdoor energy. It really is a beautiful place to call home.
It is. But keeping a place this special running and investing in its future, that comes with significant challenges.
Definitely. And lately, one of those challenges has landed squarely on kitchen tables across the area. The Northern Beaches Council rates increase.
Yeah, front and center. This topic, it sparked rallies, filled council chambers to overflowing, sometimes with pretty heated discussions by all accounts, and it affects the budget of virtually every household here.
That's right. So for our first deep dive here on Northern Beaches Living, our mission today is to take all the sources you've shared with us, the reports, the news articles, council's own materials, and really unpack this. We want to understand the fundamental pressures behind the decision, see the process council followed, dig into the different voices from the community, and crucially get you up to speed on exactly where things stand right now.
Especially after the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, that's IPART, released its decision on May 16th, 2025.
Exactly. That recent decision is key.
Okay, let's dive in then. To understand the rate rise, we first need a quick look at the Northern Beaches Council itself. It was formed back in 2016 through the amalgamation of the old Manly, Warringah, and Pittwater councils.
Right, the merger.
Yeah. Now, like many councils across New South Wales right now, it's facing some pretty significant financial headwinds. This isn't just a local issue, but the Northern Beaches has its own specific context.
And the sources lay out the core drivers of this financial pressure really clearly. A huge one is high inflation, particularly the rapidly increasing costs for things like construction materials, contractors, major projects.
Big ticket items.
Exactly. And this inflation has been seriously outpacing the rate peg, that's the limit IPART sets, on how much councils can increase their total rates income each year.
Yeah, the cap.
What the sources show is that Sydney's inflation over the 4 years leading up to June 30, 2024, was nearly double the increase in rates income allowed by the PEG over that same period.
Wow, double. That's key because it creates a growing gap in their ongoing income base compared to their actual costs. We're talking a cumulative shortfall equivalent to around $19.1 million over 4 years just compared to the standard consumer price index.
And even bigger if you look at construction costs, right?
Yeah, or an even larger $23.6 million when you specifically look at construction costs, producer price index. That difference, it just adds up year after year.
It really does. And then there's the issue of costs being shifted, pushed down from other levels of government.
Cost shifting.
The sources give a couple of concrete examples. The Emergency Services Levy, for instance, that increased by $3 million for Northern Beaches Council in just the 2023-24 financial year.
Right, and that cost lands directly on the council, doesn't it? It works out to about $30 for every single ratepayer.
Yeah, and to absorb that without cutting services, council had to actually reduce its infrastructure spending by $3 million that year.
So a direct trade-off.
Another example mentioned is the removal of state funding for essential services, like beach water quality testing. Costs that used to be covered elsewhere now fall to council.
So they're facing higher costs on one hand, costs being pushed onto them from the state level on the other, and all the while their core income growth is capped by that rate peg.
And living here, we know the weather can be pretty wild sometimes.
Tell me about it. Adding to this is the reality of living in a coastal area prone to severe weather. The Northern Beaches has been hit by 7 natural disasters in the past 6 years alone.
7 in 6 years. That's a lot.
It is. The sources put the cost of responding to those events at around $15 million, but only about $7 million of that was recovered through federal funding.
So $8 million gap just from disasters.
Roughly, yeah. That $8 million difference is another significant, unpredictable hit to the budget.
Right, and all of this, it impacts the council's ability to maintain the things we all use every day.
Yeah.
Right, the roads, the parks.
Exactly. The council manages massive infrastructure assets. We're talking about $3.9 billion worth. That covers roads, paths, parks, pools, sports facilities, stormwater networks, libraries, you name it.
It's a huge portfolio.
Huge. And when there isn't enough ongoing funding, the condition of these assets, well, it starts to decline.
Which leads to this asset backlog idea.
Precisely. And that decline creates something called an asset backlog. It's essentially a growing financial liability, the amount of money needed just to bring existing infrastructure back up to a satisfactory standard, and crucially, keep it there.
So deferred maintenance costs piling up.
Piling up. The Council's own asset management plans highlight this. They identified a need for an additional $15.1 million each year just for essential renewal and maintenance.
$15 million a year just for upkeep?
Just for that. Plus another $10.4 million annually for service uplifts or new assets needed as the community grows or, expectations change.
Okay, so add those together.
You get a gap of $25.5 million annually. That's the difference between what's needed for assets and what's currently available in the budget.
Wow, $25.5 million a year short? That number's pretty stark. It shows the pressure isn't just about covering day-to-day operating costs. It's about having enough money to stop the slow decay of essential community infrastructure.
Yeah, the sources are clear. The current income levels aren't sufficient to meet operating costs and maintain assets at the levels identified as necessary. And this is weakening key financial indicators for the Council's long-term health.
So, faced with this structural deficit, this growing asset backlog, what could Council do?
Well, they looked at the primary mechanism available to them to increase income above the rate peg, applying for a special variation, or SV.
Right, the SV.
It's a formal application process through IPART, the independent regulator, and it's not uncommon across NSW, especially for merged councils like Northern Beaches. The sources note that 57 out of the 128 NSW councils have had SVs approved since 2016-17.
Okay, so it's a known path. How did the process start here?
The process for Northern Beaches Council really kicked off with the council resolution on November 12, 2024. That resolution approved embarking on a pretty extensive community engagement to explore potential SV options. They wanted to get a sense of community priorities and, importantly, willingness to pay.
And they really went hard on the engagement, didn't they?
They definitely put the effort in. From November 18th, 2024, right through to January 12th, 2025, they ran a major engagement campaign.
What did that involve?
They launched a dedicated Your Say page online, loaded with fact sheets, videos, FAQs, and a rates calculator, which I hear was heavily used. Over 13,000 users apparently checked it out to see potential impacts on their own bills.
That calculator sounds useful.
Yeah, seemed popular. They also held information stations, ran print ads, hosted 10 in-person pop-up sessions across the area, ran webinars, did a letterbox drop to all 96,000 plus ratepayers, and emailed over 80,000 subscribers on their list.
Okay, so a lot of effort to get the information out and gather feedback. What were the actual options they put forward?
Council put forward 4 distinct options for the community to consider, showing different potential outcomes. Option 1 was essentially sticking to the rate peg. They labeled this the reduced service path, stating it was insufficient to maintain current service levels or address that asset backlog.
Okay, status quo basically means things get worse over time.
That was the implication. Option 2 was maintain service, proposing the rate peg plus an additional 6% per year for 3 years.
Moderate increase.
Then option 3, which they called improved service, proposed the rate peg plus 8.3% in year 1, 8.3% in year 2, and 8.4% in year 3. This would have been a cumulative SV of 29% over 3 years, or about 39.6% total, including the standard rate peg increases.
That's the big one they eventually applied for, right?
That's the one. And finally, option 4, increased service, suggested the rate peg plus 10% per year for 3 years, even higher.
So they tried to show a link. More money, better services, or assets.
That seemed to be the goal, trying to show the connection between funding levels and service outcomes.
And how did the community respond? Lots of feedback.
Heaps. Over 6,300 individual responses through various channels. The core themes that emerged were pretty consistent, actually.
Such as?
Well, a strong desire to maintain or improve existing services and infrastructure. That came through clearly. But also calls for council to find more internal savings and efficiencies.
That's always a popular call.
Always. Concerns about the affordability of any increase, especially given the rising cost of living. Some people pushing for rates to simply track inflation, the CPI, and others still questioning the benefits of the amalgamation itself, bringing that up again.
Now, this is where interpreting community sentiment gets really tricky, because the picture wasn't uniform across all the feedback, was it?
No, not at all. The large opt-in online survey, the one with over 5,500 responses, it showed 80% rated maintaining or improving services and infrastructure as important. So, high value placed on that.
Okay, that sounds positive for an increase.
Well, yes and no. When asked about support for the specific options, 72% supported option 2, the maintain option. But interestingly, 57% also supported option 1, the reduce option. Less support for the higher options 3 and 4.
So support for maintaining, but maybe not paying that much more.
Kind of. And then when you looked at people's first preference in that same survey, it was split pretty much down the middle. 49% chose any of the SV options, maintain, improve, or increase, and 51% chose the reduce service option, just the basic peg.
Almost perfectly split.
Almost. But then you look at the feedback received through more traditional channels like email and letter submissions, about 467 responses there, and that showed a different split.
How so?
There, 64% favored the reduced service option and only 36% favored any SV option, a much clearer preference against a significant rise in that group.
Right. And the sources mention an independent review looking at this feedback.
Yes, they do. The review apparently pointed out that the big opt-in survey captured the views of a significant number of engaged residents, which is valuable, but it wasn't necessarily representative of the entire community population distribution.
Because it's self-selecting, people who feel strongly either way are more likely to respond.
Exactly. Interestingly, they also reference a separate representative survey council did back in August 2024, so before this specific SV consultation kicked off. And in that survey, over 60% of residents indicated they were supportive of paying more if it meant improved services and infrastructure.
So depending on which set of feedback you looked at or how you weighted it, you could arguably draw different conclusions about what the community really wanted.
Absolutely. It was complex.
And this complexity all came to a head at that extraordinary council meeting on January 28th, 2025. The sources describe it as particularly raucous.
Yeah, sounds like it was quite a scene. Lots of public speakers, state and federal politicians also weighing in. The reports from that meeting highlight the differing viewpoints very clearly.
What were the main arguments flying around?
Well, some counselors and politicians advocated strongly for austerity, belt tightening. They questioned the depth or the interpretation of the community consultation results and pointed fingers at state or federal government cost shifting as the real culprit that needed fixing.
Blame game a bit.
A bit of that, yes. Others countered by referencing external audits that, they said, validated the council's financial challenges. They stressed that this funding pressure is a statewide issue, not unique to the northern beaches, trying to provide that broader context.
So, despite the divided community feedback and the passionate opposition voiced at that meeting, council ultimately had to make a decision, didn't they? Apply for an SV or not? And if so, which option?
They did. And at that January 28th meeting, after lengthy debate, Council voted 8-7, a close vote to apply to IPART for the cumulative 39.6% increase over 3 years. That was option 3, the improved service level.
The big one. Who supported it?
The sources indicate this decision was supported by the mayor and other councilors from the Your Northern Beaches independent team, along with the Greens and Good for Manly councilors.
And their justification to choosing option 3 despite the split feedback.
Council's stated justification, according to the material, was an attempt to balance the community's expressed desire for improved services and asset condition with affordability concerns. They argued that option 3 was the level needed to actually address that critical asset gap we talked about.
The $25.5 million annual shortfall.
Exactly. They said option 3 would fund improvements to key infrastructure like roads, footpaths, and stormwater, and support environmental and disaster resilience programs at the scale required.
What about finding savings internally? Did they address that?
They did. They highlighted that while they are pursuing internal savings initiatives, estimated potential annual savings of about $9 million if fully adopted, these just weren't enough on their own to cover the sheer scale of the infrastructure need identified. That $25.5 million gap is just too big.
So savings help, but don't solve the core problem.
That was their argument. A capacity to pay assessment was also done, which concluded that overall, the LGA, the local government area, had the capacity for an increase, particularly with a strong hardship policy in place for those struggling.
Okay, so the application for the full 39.6% over 3 years was formally lodged with IPART. And then we waited until May 16th, 2025.
That's right, D-Day for the decision. That's when IPART released its determination on the Northern Beaches Council's special variation application.
And the outcome, the big reveal.
IPART did not approve the full 39.6% increase the council applied for.
Ah, so a rejection.
Not a full rejection, more like a partial approval. IPART approved a cumulative increase of 25.2% over 2 years, not 3.
Okay. 25.2% over 2 years. How does that break down?
Specifically, it's an increase of 12.1% in the first year, 2025-26, and 11.7% in the second year, 2026-27. And it's important to remember, as you said, these percentages include the standard rate peg that would have applied anyway. So it's the peg plus the additional amount IPART approved.
Right. So why the partial approval? What was IPART's reasoning?
IPART's reasoning, according to their determination summary, was that while they definitely recognized Council's significant financial pressures and the clear need for increased revenue.
They acknowledged the problem.
Yes, they did. But they felt Council hadn't fully demonstrated the financial need for the entire 39.6% requested over 3 years. However, and this is a big however, they absolutely acknowledged that Council's current financial position was unsustainable long term.
So something had to change.
Definitely. They stated the infrastructure backlog and other critical requirements simply couldn't be met without a substantial increase in income. So the 25.2% they did approve is seen as providing a much-needed boost, about $50 million over those 2 years to start addressing these pressing issues.
How did the mayor react?
Mayor Sue Hines's reaction, as reported, acknowledged the IPART decision. She stated it recognized the considerable pressures Council faces: inflation, rising costs, natural emergencies, cost shifting, all those things we discussed.
She accepted the umpire's decision, basically.
Seems so. She indicated that the approved increase will allow Council to maintain core infrastructure and work towards financial stability, specifically targeting the repair and renewal of roads, footpaths, rock pools, stormwater systems, and other community facilities that need urgent attention.
So while it's a significant increase for ratepayers, it's less than council hoped for. What are the consequences of that reduced amount?
Well, the main consequence, particularly the removal of the proposed third year of increase, means that some of the larger, more ambitious renewal projects that were included in Council's Option 3 plans,
Like the big upgrades.
things like potential major redevelopments of the Warringo Aquatic Center or the Manly Life-Saving Club facilities, those are now less likely to proceed in the near future unless Council can secure significant external funding, like grants, or perhaps make a separate future application to IPART specifically for those projects down the track.
So the focus shifts to the absolute must-dos first.
Exactly. The focus will be on the most critical infrastructure repairs first, fixing potholes, leaky pools, crumbling paths.
And what does this actually mean for you, the average residential ratepayer, in dollar terms?
Okay, the approved 25.2% cumulative increase over 2 years translates, on average, to an additional cost of about $42 per quarter in the first year. That's 2025-26.
$42 a quarter extra.
Yeah, compared to what you would have paid if only the standard rate peg had applied. So that's roughly $168 extra per year initially, on top of the standard peg component, which you'd pay anyway.
Okay, that gives people a concrete number to think about. Is this completely finalized now?
Almost, but not quite locked in stone just yet. While IPART has approved the amount of the increase Council is allowed to levy, Council itself still needs to formally vote on and adopt its final budget for the next financial year. That usually happens in June. That budget will incorporate this approved rate rise.
Right, so a final council vote is still needed.
Correct. It's expected to pass given the IPART approval, but it's a necessary final step.
Stepping back to the bigger picture, though, as we touched on at the start, the Northern Beaches Council situation, this whole saga, it isn't unique, is it?
No, not at all. The sources really reinforce that. These financial pressures, driven by infrastructure backlogs, rising costs way above the peg, cost shifting, disaster impacts, constraints on income growth, they're affecting councils right across the state. It's something a NSW parliamentary inquiry has also acknowledged as a systemic issue.
And this whole process, from the initial problem to the community consultation to the IPART decision, it really highlights the incredibly complex balancing act councils face, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. They have to somehow meet community expectations for high-quality services and well-maintained infrastructure, which, let's face it, everyone wants.
Of course.
But they have to do it in an economic environment where costs, especially for construction and contracts, are accelerating much faster than their primary regulated income stream, the rates, allows.
There's also that ongoing tension, which was really evident in the community feedback and council's response around efficiency versus revenue.
Yeah, the call for savings. While councils are absolutely expected to find savings, and Northern Beaches Council outlined potential savings, this case suggests that the sheer scale of the funding gap, especially for maintaining critical assets built up over decades, might simply be too large to be bridged by efficiency measures alone.
Meaning an increase in revenue was likely unavoidable, as IPART's partial approval ultimately affirmed.
That seems to be the conclusion IPART reached, yes.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this first deep dive for Northern Beaches Living. We've looked at the fundamental financial pressures squeezing Northern Beaches Council, that combination of inflation, cost shifting, disaster recovery costs, and that really significant asset backlog.
We went through the council's detailed engagement process, the complicated and sometimes conflicting community feedback they received, that heated council meeting where they decided to push for the substantial increase.
And finally, IPART's recent decision to grant a significant, though reduced, rate rise over the next 2 years.
We've seen what drove the council's application and what the final IPART decision means for you as a resident. An increase is coming, it seems, directed towards addressing critical infrastructure needs that have been accumulating for some time.
But it also means some larger, perhaps more desirable capital projects might be delayed or need other funding sources found.
That's the trade-off with the reduced approval.
So what does this all highlight as we wrap up? Maybe something for you to think about. Consider what this entire process reveals about the intricate, sometimes messy relationship between local government finance, state-level economic regulation like the rate peg, the diverse and sometimes conflicting priorities within our own community, and simply the rising real-world costs of maintaining the essential infrastructure in the places we live and love.
Especially in a changing economic and environmental climate.
Exactly. How should councils, how should we as a community truly navigate that difficult space between keeping things affordable right now and making the necessary, often expensive, long-term investments the essential physical fabric of our communities for the future?
It's a tough question. No easy answers there.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive on Northern Beaches living.